Well, this is me when I was 4. And if I had known then what I know now, I would have known that I had options in addition to growing up to be a cowboy. But who in 1944 had any idea about this wonderful rehabilitation profession called speech-language pathology? Not many, I imagine. If I had known then, and then is now a few years later, and here I am with Tom and Larry. If I had known then that WHO, WHO, was not only a band, but was also an acronym for the World Health Organization, I would have been a better clinician earlier on. I would have been a better clinician for the first person with a nearly pure apraxic syndrome I saw during my training. I also would have been better able, I suspect, to predict that I wouldn't see another nearly pure apraxia syndrome for another decade or more. This woman's name was Mrs. C. She was from a small Wisconsin town, but married to a soldier who was stationed in Denver where I was taking my training. Well, that World Health Organization model, which you can see here, would have reminded me that those of us who communicate, or any of us, comprise body structure, function, activities, and participation, and that environmental factors and personal factors interact with all of these domains to influence our health, and in the context of this presentation, how well we do with our communication. I would have known that treating her impairment, her body structure function, with a concentration on sound production in syllables and in words, would not guarantee greater activity and greater participation, that there is nothing inevitable about a transfer from work at the body structure and function level to either activities or participation, and that a variety of environmental and personal factors influence, block, or facilitate any transfer that does occur. I would have known that treating her while her husband was told to sit in the waiting room would slow generalization. I would have known that having her do homework from a workbook rather than a therapeutic conversation with her husband dampened her neuroplasticity. I would have known that imitation of my productions, regardless of how clear they were, was not failing because I was not getting enough responses. Imitation was failing because imitation is not use. And sometimes it's not even a critical step toward use or functional performance, and perhaps it's no exaggeration to say that sometimes, in fact, it makes transfer less rather than more likely. Had I known then, this is my office at the VA, what I know now, I would have known that IOM was not just the Isle of Man and a marvelous trio from that isle, but was also the Institute of Medicine with its own models of enablement. I would have known that a speaker's environment is critical, and that changing and enriching that environment, as with a program of communication partners or whatever your favorite environmental manipulation program might be, is a legitimate therapeutic goal, and most times critical to the highest level of recovery. And I would have known, because this model relates the person to the environment And how one does is a reflection of the interaction of the person with the environment. And I would have known that Mrs. C's husband, had I allowed him into that suite and not only allowed him to sit there, but invited him to become part of the treatment, had I done that, Mrs. C would have done better, I think, and they would have been happier. Had I known then, in the era of Pink Floyd, what I know now, thanks Adele, I would have known that the biopsychosocial model, with its emphasis on the psychological, the social, and the biomedical, and the interaction of these to produce health, the interaction of these as the basis for rehabilitation, improvement, and sometimes recovery, was a better fit for rehab than the traditional biomedical model, in which, and I admit this is a simplification, the sick person arrives at a facility, disappears, but then comes out cured or at least better. I would have known that clinical practice, to be maximally successful, happens in the world and not just in the clinic. I would have been able perhaps even to contribute to, not merely appreciate, this living with aphasia diagram that points out that living with aphasia, living with any communication deficit, perhaps living with any deficit at all, reflects an interaction of personal identity and attitudes and feelings, and in the case of language, language and related impairments, and the communication and language environment and participation in life situations, and that we live best, perhaps, if we have some expansion, balance, stability in those four domains. And that each clinician, I think, can profitably spend time examining personal beliefs and emotions about rehabilitation and patients' significant others. And I would refer you to this 2014 publication, SLT process of including significant others in the International Journal of Communication Disorders, because it points out that many clinicians believe that they and patients are the primary focus, in fact, the sole focus in many instances of rehabilitation. Those authors, probably many people listening to this presentation, and I, agree that this is too narrow a focus. Because you see, families, patients as well, but we're talking about families for now, may believe something else. Some, of course, do believe that rehabilitation is solely a concentration on their loved one's aphasia. Interesting discussion of that point of view in this publication. Most, however, have some mix of 7 goals or needs of rehabilitation, and I thank Howe and his colleagues for this information. Those 7 needs, and we can ask ourselves how, as rehabilitationists, we meet each one, or if we do. The need for hope, we're probably pretty good here. The need to be included in rehabilitation, I think we're getting better, and that's not merely to be an observer, but to be an active participant. To be able to communicate and maintain relationships, and that's not eventually, after treatment is over, that's during the whole course of treatment. And the need for information. Oh, we're very good here. We've been good here since probably the 40s. And for support, we've always been good here. We are always willing to spend a little extra time. The 6th goal is to be able to look after their own well-being. Well, we may not be the best trained to do that, but certainly members of a healthcare team need to be attentive to that and to be able to cope with new responsibilities. And part of being able to cope with new responsibilities is being taught from day one how to enhance communication, regardless of how limited, with a spouse or other loved one. Had I known then, when I was standing with Deal and Johns and LaPointe at a CAC back in the 70s, what I know now. I would have known that clinicians do not change other people, that people with willingness and ability change themselves with the support, information, and guidance of clinicians. If I had known then, as I stood outside my VA office, what I know now, I would have known that simple motor therapies for motor speech disorders are totally inadequate, and that motor speech disorders require cognitive motor therapies. I would have known that they require spending as much or more time teaching patients to value and remember what to do as we presently spend teaching them what to do. Actually, this is in many instances the much easier lesson. Cognitive motor treatment means in part guaranteeing that each patient is willing to speak therapeutically and not merely speak. If speaking were therapeutic, most patients would not become our clients. And being able to select and plan their responses rather than to rely for selection upon the clinician. And to evaluate the adequacy of each response before the clinician adds his or her attaboy, nice going, or let's try it a little differently. And planning how to improve the inadequate ones, again, before the clinician offers a suggestion about think about it and slow down. Oh, yeah. I was to talk about influence, and I guess I thought about this a long time. I think I have been more influenced than influential. I've been influenced by, in those days, Nancy Helmaster Brooks and Audrey Holland, by Chick LaPointe, by Ron Netzel and Ray Kent, by Kevin Kearns, by Joe Duffy, by Tom Prescott, by Mick McNeil, by Terry Wirtz, by Jim Ayton, by Fred Darley, by John Deal, by Bob Brookshire, by Rich Katz, and probably most of all, by my wife, Deborah Scheinman. And I've learned a lot from them. I've learned, I think, something about influence, and perhaps it's this, that influence results most predictably from having others see you doing your best, uncontaminated by any desire to convince them of anything. And now let's go back to Mrs. C. She allowed me to save face. She acted as if what I was doing was just what she needed. If I could see her now, 47 years later, I may have learned enough to pay her back for that kindness. I may have learned enough so that she could predictably have said something like, Jay, you're not doing a bad job for a kid, rather than having merely to rely upon patting my hand and getting a reassuring look on her face. I want to thank you again for the honor of this invitation and just point out that some early ambitions die really hard. Thank you again.
Thank you, Jay. Very much appreciate that. And now what we'll do is go through the process right now of getting this the PowerPoint shifted over to Jackie Hinckley, which we are doing right now. And Jackie, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful, Jackie. It is all yours.
Okay. I'm very happy and honored to be part of this webinar. And first, I just want to say that in the process of working on this webinar, I discovered that I have something in common with Jay, and that is that I, too, wanted to be a cowboy. And, in fact, that desire persisted for a long time. although I'm not wearing any boots right now. But in addition to that, I think the message that Jay left us with about influence may come from going about what you are doing something very sincerely and truthfully, and I think that's a great message, and I think maybe what I'm going to be talking about springs from there very nicely. So we were asked to reflect on our careers and think about what we knew when we were early in our careers and looking back at that, and maybe some tips or strategies. So I settled on a couple of different stories, but that was actually after my first reaction to being invited to speak at this webinar, which was to think to myself, well, do I influence anybody? But of course, everybody influences somebody. You influence the people immediately around you, whether you mean to or not, and you influence them somehow. So with that in mind, I thought back to things, and I came up with a couple of messages and a couple of stories that I thought I could share today. And the first one is titled, "Stand Your Ground, but make darn sure you have some ground to stand on." So this story starts when I was just a few years into my career, and I had my first managerial or administrative position at the University of Michigan Aphasia program. Now, I think most people know that that program has a very long history, and it was one of the original intensive aphasia programs that was set up to serve veterans returning from World War II. And it morphed into different configurations through the university, but at the time that I joined up, it was making a transition from being a student training clinic to being a fully professional clinic, which wasn't too far away from what I myself was doing, making the transition from a student learner to some sort of manager type person. So in those very early days, around 1990, a lot of my days at the aphasia program were spent calling people and telling them about the program and what it was and the idea of intensive therapy. In fact, making a lot of cold calls. At that time, the program was very little known. It kind of had its dips and peaks over the decades. So one day, I got a call from someone whose reputation really intimidated me at that point in my career. I was really overjoyed that the program had come to someone's attention, someone at that level of our field, until I got on the phone with the person and discovered what they were calling about. And the person said to me, "Don't you think you're selling snake oil? These chronic aphasic patients don't need and can't use intensive therapy." Well, my reaction was shock, dismay, worry, insecurity, self-doubt, and I'm sure that after I had some sort of a kind of a meltdown, anyway, you get the picture, I managed to take a deep breath, and I thought to myself, now wait a minute. We are standing on some ground. We have some ground to stand on. So at that time, the ground that we had to stand on, some of which had been published way back in the early days. The publications about intensive aphasia therapy began in our speech pathology journals in 1944. And although these various publications would today be referred to as practice-based evidence and did not use the kind of rigorous scientific designs that we might prefer now. Nonetheless, there were multiple reports from numerous clients across different programs around the country about the outcomes of intensive aphasia therapy. And the philosophy of intensive aphasia therapy at that time was actually quite consistent with many things that we feel are important now. So, for example, in 1945, Backus wrote, "In the case of soldiers disabled by aphasia, the responsibility is threefold. We must help the patient make the best possible adjustment personally, socially, and economically, regardless of the degree to which it is possible to restore language." Also, in time at the early 90s, neuroscientists were accumulating a lot of evidence about brain plasticity. Obviously, much more is known now, but this little book, which was originally intended as a summary of what was known about brain plasticity at that time and written for lay people, was a great summary. So that evidence was already accumulating. So when I took a deep breath, I realized, we have some ground to stand on. It may not be the perfect ground, it may not be everything we want, but we are standing on some ground, and we can describe it and characterize it. Of course, we also ourselves wanted to work on collecting our own outcomes and being honest and careful about what we were actually achieving. And we did manage to do that, and I just want to say as a side note, it took a few years and several attempts and several different journals to get anything about intensive aphasia treatment published back in those days, but we managed to eventually do it. And of course, today, we have such a wonderful, reassuring accumulation of evidence about intensity of treatment from numerous researchers and numerous programs. So I totally support increasing the likelihood that our therapy will have the desired effect by relying on evidence-based practices. But then again, there's a tension between innovation and the accumulation of evidence, and sometimes we get caught in there. And those two things occur at completely different points in time. So, echoing what the message Jay left us with, I think we have to be very honest. We have to use our absolute best, most rational, most compassionate judgment about when to stand, and we have to be very clear about what kind of ground we are standing on. I think when we know what ground we're standing on, we're clear about it to ourselves and to others without understating or apologizing, and also without overstating, then we increase our chances of influencing someone positively. The second story I'd like to share is entitled "Be Who You Are." I also will just note here that if I had known when I was throwing out a whole bunch of old pictures that I was going to be asked to do this webinar, I would have saved some of the ones anyway. So here's a nice copy instead. All right, so Be Who You Are. This story starts in 1990. And what happened at that time is I attended a conference for people with degenerative eye diseases like mine, sponsored by the Foundation Fighting Blindness. And I attended this conference because despite all my appointments with specialists and eye doctors and specialized social workers and all these professional appointments that I had had around my own vision, I still didn't really see the path. I didn't see how I would manage or what choices I should maybe be making, considering, and I just couldn't see the life path that I would pick. So I attended this conference, and there were so many resources and other people who were finding ways to manage that it was the first time that I really felt comfortable in my own skin, I guess, and saw a path, how I would be able to manage as time went on. Well, I returned from that conference back to work at the Aphasia program. And I started thinking to myself, our clients have all these professional appointments. Well, they have appointments with professionals like me. And I wonder, maybe all those professional appointments are not adding up to a vision of their life path, just like it didn't add up for me either. Maybe they need those same kinds of information and resources and social support. So we were fortunate at that time to be able to set about creating conferences for people with aphasia. And the idea was really that they would be provided with the resources and the hope, and that they would be inspired or helped in the same way that I was helped by attending my conference. Now, back in the early 90s, we did this conference, and our conference was called Opening Doors. But of course, lots of people in lots of places have done these conferences, especially over the years. But in this case, I guess this story, I was able at least to come back from a personal experience and influence my coworkers to the extent that we managed to pull this conference together year after year, and hopefully helped and inspired some people with aphasia as well along the way. Theory and evidence suggests that one of the characteristics of being an expert is enfolding creativity and other aspects of your personal experience into your professional work. And so I think that when we embrace particular characteristics of ourselves, and we're clear-headed and honest about bringing them into what we're doing, we can make a particular contribution, whether it be to an individual client or to our colleagues or coworkers or more. Sometimes, particularly when I reflect back to my early years, I would often look around and think to myself, well, I'm thinking this way, or I'm having this idea, but I'm not sure that anyone else is thinking that, and so it's making me feel very insecure, and I'm not sure. Obviously, we have to mesh these viewpoints together, but if we assess the ground that we have to stand on and bring our unique characteristics to bear, then I think that's when we find that sweet spot for being able to influence other people either in our workplace or in our community. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jackie. Thank you very much. We're going to go here and make a quick change over to Mary Jo. And then one moment, friends, and I'm just... takes about 3 or 4 clicks to pull this off. Mary Jo, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
That's a beautiful thing. You should have the opportunity to pull up your slides at this point. Or bear
Can
with
you
me.
see them?
Not quite yet, because I thought I had hit the right button. Well, let's see. There we go. We have seen
All
them.
right.
You're ready to go, Mary Jo.
Thank you very much. And I have to tell you, I am very honored to be on the docket with Dr. Hinckley and Dr. Rosenbek. And I think we didn't know what anybody was going to talk about before this. And I think mine is a little more nuts and bolts, but I'm going to have at it. What I know now that I wish I knew then, times 7. financial disclosures. I actually did not aspire to be a cowboy when I grew up, unlike Jay. I really wanted to be the actress on the cowboy show. I wanted to be the singer and the dancer on the cowboy show, especially Hopalong Cassidy. And I guess I wish I had known about aphasia a whole lot sooner. Because for the first 25 years or so of my life, I thought I was going to be a Broadway star. And somewhere in my 20s, I got a gift. My group got a gig from the State Department to sing and dance our way through Latin America in the late 60s. And we went 2 summers, and to tell you the truth, it changed the way I looked at the world. And at the end of that, I thought to myself, I want to do something more worthwhile. I want to do something more personal. So, not to put down the theater I grew up in, but when I got back to New York, I signed up for the master's program at Teachers College because I was going to be a bilingual speech pathologist. I got my master's there in 1970, and how many courses I took in aphasia was exactly none. Aphasia was an elective, and I was going to reach the world, so I didn't take it. In 1970, I also got married, moved back to Latin America, and then 5 years later, we came back to New York with 2 little kids, and I always tell the story that after I had 2 kids, I decided I was really interested in working with adults. And after I had 4 kids, I was convinced to work with people with Alzheimer's disease. But that's another story. Anyway, I got back. I applied to the doctoral program at Teachers College. I applied for a VA traineeship, which was the best. And the first course that I had to take was aphasia. And talk about art of influence. My first course was Syra Grodsky. I don't know how many of you know him. He was mentor also to Roberta Chapey and to Rosemary Lubinsky. He was very interested in the 70s in divergent versus convergent language, which was about conversation. He was angry at all the great tests that were coming out in the 70s because he felt they didn't tell you anything at all about how people with aphasia communicate in the world. And most of all, what I got from him and from Dr. Sachs, Oliver Sachs, who he worked with up at Beth Abraham, was that aphasia was so interesting. It's always interesting. I have a video of him talking to a woman at Beth Abraham Hospital who had global aphasia, and he's sitting there smoking his pipe, and she's smoking a cigarette, and they are having the best conversation about a vacation in Hawaii. And Cy could talk to anybody, talk about life participation. I wish I knew then, number 2, how important groups are to the therapeutic process. I spent those 5 years between the Brooklyn VA and the St. Albans Extended Care Facility, and there were, of course, lots of guys coming back from Vietnam and all the World War II veterans having strokes, and it was a great experience, but even then, after a year, people aged out or services were terminated. Can you imagine? Then it was 1 year. Now, what's the DRG like? Like 3 days, I don't know. Anyway, there was also at St. Albans a young PhD in his first job named Bob Goldfarb, and I don't know if you had a chance to hear him at ASHA this year do a talk called An Aphasiologist Has a Stroke. But he really was a great advocate for veterans and worried a lot about them after they timed out at the VA. And he began advocating stroke clubs. And we had some great stroke clubs, actually. I'm going to run out of time, but one time we took a bunch of the aphasic veterans to Yankee Stadium to see a great game. Jim Palmer pitched. And afterwards, we couldn't get the cars out of the parking lots. And we lost the guys, and we finally found them sitting on a curb drinking beer out of paper bags. But I'll tell you, it was a great life participation event. From the VA and TC, I went on to Rutgers University, and you could see we had, at that time, a very lovely Victorian house as our speech and hearing clinic. And I got there, I was finally teaching aphasia, and we had 2 clients with aphasia. And only 2 students could see them once a week. It wasn't working. So I took what I knew about groups, and I called the local paper, and I got permission to use a room in the gym, and we founded the Rutgers Community Stroke Club. 6 people showed up for the first meeting, and that club went on in one form or another until 2012, almost 30 years. However, what I wish I knew then that I know now was more about location, transportation, and parking. Over its 30-year life, that stroke club moved first from Rutgers University because when they closed down the program, they wouldn't give us a room anymore. We moved from there to the New Jersey Speech and Hearing headquarters. When they got a management company, we couldn't meet there anymore. We moved to the American Heart Association headquarters. That chapter closed. Finally, we moved to Middlesex Hospital, really nice hospital, really good community education program. They gave us an auditorium with parking down the side. Then they started building, and they became Robert Wood Johnson Hospital, and they became Robert Wood Johnson University Medical Center and State Trauma Center. And you can see by the picture, eventually, they took up all of New Brunswick. It is a huge, huge hospital center today. And little by little, the stroke club finally died. It died because of the growth of the hospital. The hospital is a huge mega business anymore, huge turnover, much less interest in community events or community education. It died because they stuck us first in an atrium when they constructed something over the auditorium, and they moved us to a place in the back of the outpatient clinic so that nobody could find, and you had to walk for miles to get to. And most of all, if you want to know, I blame it on parking. You had to park far away in a garage if you could find a place. And I think parking finally did us in. And beyond that, I started to see that your once-a-month meeting was really limited in terms of life participation, even though we had lots of picnics and lots of lunches out and lots of friendships. I also saw that it wasn't enough for students to come to have a client or 2 in school and then come to the stroke club once a month. So I got to Kean University in 1995, and it was a little like starting over. Same situation, cramped old clinic. I had one aphasic patient. He was, his wife only spoke Hungarian. It was cramped. When I started the caregiver group, we met in a noisy, messy hallway with a lot of distractions. And all that while that I was moving along in aphasia, in the aphasia world, LPAA was growing as well. And more I was convinced that this was the way to go. This is where it was at. So number 4, what I wish I knew then was how to go about retrofitting an academic program to accommodate life participation. I felt like maybe I could sell this idea to administration and find some funding, and we could do a life participation program right in the university. I wanted to find a way that every student would work with aphasic clients, that every student would get to know families, that we would have a life participation setting where we could do research on the life participation process. And I wanted to serve the community. I'll tell you in a minute how many people there are in New Jersey with aphasia. And it happened. I applied for grants. We built a bigger and bigger adult clinical program until finally in 2008, we got a 3-year, $150,000 grant to add to what we already had. We moved to a brand new, really terrific state-of-the-art clinic, and we hired Wendy Greenspan, whom you may know at Aphasia Access, to direct what was called the Institute for Adults Living with Communication Disabilities. And it worked right from the first year. We had more than 25 people with aphasia every semester. Every student had to have at least one semester, usually two, doing individual therapy and group therapy and participating in the life participation activities. This is our drumming group on the right, by the way. That was a great semester. And we developed a variety of ongoing groups. You can see our choir is on the left, and if I had more time, I'd tell you about the restaurant group on the right, which was really a gas. And we sponsored community events. This is a fun run that we have every year. We were super speech pathologists this year, and the clients come out with the kids and the adults. And in the lower right-hand corner, you can see this is our aphasia choir, and as the faculty and the students and the participants came through, they sang "We Are the Champions." It was great. And after 3.5 years, the grant money ran out, and then Wendy took another job, and I was devastated. So number 5, what I wish I knew then, was how well life participation could fit into our academic program and into our setting totally on its own merits, never mind the grants, never mind the support and the publicity. Maybe because we had sown the seeds, the students continued to be so enthusiastic. When they come into the program in an orientation, I always ask them, how many of you came to Kean because you wanted to work with little children? And every hand goes up. And then I say, well, my job is to make you want to work with adults. And they roll their eyes. But I would say more than half of our kids leave here enthusiastic to work with adults. My colleagues as well, and not only my colleagues, but we're in a health sciences program in the graduate school, and we have been delighted. Our occupational program, our clinical psych program, our rec therapy program, our physician's assistant program have all sponsored projects with us and gone out into the community with us, and it's been terrific. Right now we have, if I can brag just a little bit, we usually have, right this semester we have more than 30 aphasic participants. We have, all homage to Dr. Hinckley, we have an ICAP program in its second semester, and it's growing, and it's a wonderful externship for 2 students, and we're hoping to make it, based on Michigan's model, a year-round project. We have at least 3 ongoing funded faculty research projects going on in the life participation clinic. And the students, we require a thesis, and our students have really done a terrific job of coming up with good research. On the left, 2 of my students presenting at the Aphasia Access in Boston, that conference last March, and 3 of my students presented this year their aphasia projects at ASHA, and that's Robin on the right. And maybe partly why it happened, and I have to give her credit, is our clinic coordinator, who really took it on. She had worked with kids before she came here, and she just got it. And she wrote a piece that I would really like Aphasia Access to publish. That starts off, yesterday I learned what life participation is all about. And if I could take 30 seconds, the story was that one of our clients passed away, a lovely woman who had been with us a couple of years and whose husband had been in our caregiver group. The day she died, as an aside, her husband came to caregiver group before he went to the viewing. Shows you how powerful those ties were. And when Susan got to the viewing, she was amazed, because this is a woman who had been aphasic for maybe 5 years, and her personal contacts had dwindled somewhat. But there were students not just from now, but from 4 and 5 years ago, and they knew everybody. They knew the grandchildren's names. They knew what to say. And she was so impressed with how much a part of their life the students were, and how much a part of the student's life the client was, or the client's family was. And the other thing we have now is very close ties with the Adler Aphasia Center, and that's my I Wish I Knew Then, number 6. I have another long story I won't tell about being at the National Aphasia Association conference maybe 12 or 15 years ago, and Martha Taylor Sarno said, "Hang around, you're the only aphasia person I know in New Jersey, and there's a couple here that's looking to start an aphasia center." And she said, "Personally, I wouldn't be too hopeful. You know, when these wealthy people start these things, I think things have to come from the grassroots, and you don't just start from the top down." But the truth was, this effort of the Adlers has been so successful and so influential as a nonprofit, non-treatment-oriented, community-based aphasia center. And I can't tell you the influence they have had in the state of New Jersey. And here's a few years after they opened, here's their second center, and there in the blue jacket is my Wendy. And that's fine. And it's fine because Adler provides us with student externships. So many of my students volunteer there or in their groups. They provide a lot of training, real-life training for both the students and the faculty. We have a lot of joint projects with them. We have a community aphasia group in Toms River. They sponsor a lot of statewide presentations with us and the other colleges. And they've helped us make a lot of friends with and without aphasia. And that brings us to my last point, is government initiatives. I wish I had known way sooner that seeking public policy changes for persons with aphasia might really be a worthwhile thing to do. It isn't that I didn't have any public policy training. When I was NUJISHA president, I testified many times for state licensure, newborn hearing screening. When I was on legislative council, we went every year and lobbied for changes in Medicare, etc. But it didn't occur to me, to try to take this route for aphasia until Adler set about making contacts with people in the government. And it turned out that Loretta Weinberg, who is the lady with the red scarf on the right of your screen, her sister and her mother both had aphasia, and she became interested in the Adler Center. And through her, we sponsored and passed 2 bills in the legislature to create an aphasia study commission. The study commission ran for a year, 2013, 2014. The governor never appointed all the members, but we had 2 members with aphasia, 2 members who were speech pathologists, Karen Adler from aphasia, and some public members and Department of Health members. We learned a lot in that year. Just briefly, the prevalence of aphasia, which we tried to figure out statistically, is probably twice what we advertise. It's probably over 2 million, and a conservative estimate of the number of people with aphasia in New Jersey is about 72,000 with chronic aphasia. We learned a lot about unmet needs. To make a long story short, south of the Raritan River, about halfway down New Jersey, there are virtually no services, community or otherwise, people with aphasia, unless you live close to Philadelphia. And we looked at existing programs and we made some recommendations. One of the recommendations we made was for a permanent aphasia task force. So we had the honor of winning an award from New Jersey Speech and Hearing, but subsequent to that, we were able to, Todd came up and we testified with the New Jersey Speech and Hearing Association and with Adler on behalf of a permanent aphasia task force. The bill passed the Senate and the Assembly and moved on to the governor's desk, and on one of the rare days that Mr. Christie was in the state last month, he pocket vetoed ours and about 150 other bills. So the question at this point, what I wish I knew now, was where we're going from here. And I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Jo. I really appreciate that and your sharing your thoughts with everyone. I'm going to make a couple of changes here real quick, and we have time for one or two quick questions. If you happen to have a question, you can let us know when you're going. Mary Jo, if you'll just keep your screen open to where you are, that would be a huge help. Or let me see what I can do. Someone wrote in, I notice a bit of a sub-theme, ways to help envision the path to the future, to live with aphasia and to gain hope. Wondering what personal traits or experiences of clinicians help them embrace these concepts that have been traditionally on the edges of clinical practice. Is there someone who might want to take a shot at that question and offer some thoughts on the concepts in there?
Can we hear the question again?
Yeah. I'm not. Yeah.
Well, here, I'm going to start you with a different one then. Here's a question. I think
We're sorry, whoever submitted that.
that's all right.
Can we just hear it again? I think.
Sure. Here's what they wrote. I notice a bit of a sub-theme, ways to help people envision the path to the future, to live with aphasia, and to gain hope. What personal traits or experiences of clinicians help them embrace these concepts that have been traditionally on the edges of clinical practice?
Go ahead, Dr. Hinckley.
Okay, I'll just say a couple things off the top of my head, and I'd like to hear what Jay and Mary Jo have too. But I think one thing is the experience of seeing people trying to go about their life again. A lot of times, clinicians are exposed to a very short time frame segment of that person's life without the opportunity to contextualize it in that person's entire life. It's just their focus is such a discrete focus on very specific tasks and activities without the bigger picture of the person's, life story, for example, and we tend to put it in little parts. And I think even though now I think more and more the emphasis is on a more whole life, holistic experience, I'm not sure that we do as good a job emphasizing that or bringing that into clinical practice as we could.
Hello?
Hello.
Todd?
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Now I can.
Oh, wonderful. Something happened. My apologies there. We'll get that cleaned up for the archive. We did have another question. Given our current state of knowledge or awareness, what are some ways you all have been encouraging or equipping people with aphasia to advocate for themselves or aphasia in general? Does
I think
anyone?
Adler
Yep.
has some wonderful programs, and some of, I would like to say we do, but a lot of what we do is an imitation of what they do. One of the things they do routinely and reach many, many people is have persons with aphasia educating student doctors, EMS people, a variety of professionals in what aphasia is and how to talk to somebody with aphasia, and they get a great deal of satisfaction out of that, but it plays a really big role in treatment in New Jersey, I think. And I know that a lot of the other aphasia centers have had projects like where they educate the local business people using the person with aphasia, having the people with aphasia do the treating. Our best time was we had a woman, one of our people had a bad experience in a restaurant, and she came in and she was ticked off. So we, and the restaurant is very near here, and the group decided to revamp they found the menu online, they revamped the menu to make it aphasia friendly. They invited wait staff from the restaurant to come over to our school to hear about how they should interact with people with aphasia. And we talked to the manager. Anyway, long story short, that was one of the pictures I showed. We took the whole group to that restaurant on a price fixed menu, and it was terrific. So it educated everybody to some extent. It was, and the students, not the least of it.
Wonderful, thank you. One last question, and this one's for Jackie, if she can hear me. Someone would like to know where you think we're going from here.
That question's for me particularly?
That is particularly for you.
Oh, dear. Wow. Where are we going from here? I think that a lot of these things that we now know are very important, I guess, I'm not sure if I'm being very coherent, but here's the first thing that comes to the top of my head. Many of these things that we know are very important from the point of view of plasticity, like Jay mentioned, from the point of view of life, from the point of view of hope. All these things that we know are important, but they're not very, they're very inconsistently embedded or implemented in practice. So from all kinds of medicine and all kinds of clinical practice, we know that there's lots of geographic variations in all different kinds of clinical practices, and I think we have a lot of variation in our practices in speech pathology, partially geographic, but perhaps more than that, in terms of really building these things and making systemic changes in how people actually receive services and receive the benefit of life participation. So I think that the future, one of the things that really has to be a big emphasis is how are we going to make this more systemic? And it's not, I mean, one thing might be more aphasia centers, but I'm not really just talking about that. I'm talking about how do we bring clinicians, on average, up to speed on many of these issues? How can we build it into the electronic record system, the policies, so that the majority of people with aphasia can benefit from these things? My although I have no data for this whatsoever, but my suspicion is that a very small percentage of people with aphasia are benefiting from all these wonderful things, cutting edge things, or even just the middle of the road things that we know are good practice. So somehow, if we can make that, bridge that gap, to me is really important thing for us to put on the front burner.
Great, thank you, Jackie. That's about all the time we have for questions. So I want to thank our presenters, Jay, Jackie, and Mary Jo, for taking time out of their schedule. A couple of last thoughts. We appreciate you being on this first webinar. If you'd like to join us for subsequent webinars or keep up with our training opportunities, you can find that information at aphasiaaccess.org/training. We'll have a short survey out tomorrow about this. Grateful if you'd take a couple minutes to share your thoughts so we can strengthen the offerings that we do put out there. We'll also have the archive available for this early next week. Our goal is to turn these around more quickly in the 2016 series, so keep an eye out for that. Also want to just give you a quick note that the Aphasia Institute up in Canada is having a webinar in mid-March. If you're interested, they've always been kind enough to give us a shout out about these, so we wanted to return the favor. They're at aphasia.ca, and hope you just continue the conversation. One of the things that we think is really important is to have a place for everyone to get together, share their thoughts, and talk about the challenges and find ways to strengthen what we're all doing in various parts of the region and parts of our where we are through collective dialogue. And I think we've accomplished that today. So my thanks to our presenters again, Jackie Hinckley, Jay Rosenbek, and Mary Jo Santo Pietro, and appreciate you joining us for the first webinar of Aphasia Access's 2016 webinar series. Have a great day.